Hello, this is the World of the 20th Century podcast, and I'm your professor, Adam Wolf. History. Lesson 6. Chapter 14. Moscow, Washington, and the End of the Soviet Empire. This chapter examines the incredible events which unfolded in the later 1980s, in which one communist government after another collapsed in Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union itself imploded and dissolved in 1991. This marked the end of the Cold War and an unsuccessful decades-old experiment in political and economic manifestations of communism. The fates of both the Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviet Union itself were intertwined, as events in the one shaped the other. If one figure were to be highlighted in bringing about the end of communism, that would be Mikhail Gorbachev, who, at the relatively younger age of 54, became General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and therefore its leader. Gorbachev was a believer in Marxist-Leninism. He was a believer in the foundational principles of communism, though he saw the need to reform the Soviet Union from within. He grew up in Stalinist Soviet Union, in fact on a collectivized farm. In 1978 he was appointed to the Communist Party Secretariat with special responsibility for agriculture. In this role he had a privileged view of the country's deep economic troubles, and was also being groomed to one day take the reins of power. With all of the reforms which Gorbachev initiated, it is important to remember that at no time did he contemplate the breakup of the Soviet Union. His was a reformist message, to stabilize and improve the country from within. Gorbachev's domestic program can be characterized by the terms glasnost, perestroika, and democratization. Glasnost referred to the opening up of society, with more freedom of expression and even criticism of the government. Dissident writers were freed from prisons. Films and books which were previously banned because they attacked the Soviet government or promoted undesirable ideas were now available. In 1988, the government even stopped jamming foreign radio broadcasts so that citizens could now listen to radio from other countries. Perestroika referred to the restructuring of the Soviet economy. In the end, this did not work, and the long-term structural problems of the communist system brought the walls tumbling down. However, Gorbachev did try some things, such as attempting to reduce the centralized control of the economy, which was such an inefficient way of doing things. In a centralized economy, decisions are made at the top and implemented on the ground, and often what was planned or forecast at the top bear no relation to realities on the ground. In the attempt to decentralize the economy, more local initiatives would be encouraged at factories and farms, and even some limited private enterprise allowed. Democratization referred to increasing the participation of Soviet citizens in the political process. A large part of this was to slowly reduce the role of the Communist Party. One example was to allow multiple candidate elections. Notice I said multiple candidate, not multiple party. Thus, while one now had the choice of several candidates, they were all of the same party, the Communist Party. Another reform instituted was the secret ballot. Gorbachev sought reform, but faced three significant challenges between 1988 and 1991. These were a nationalities crisis, a political crisis, and an economic crisis. The Soviet Union was a union of Soviet republics, and under glasnost, nationalist feeling in several of the republics intensified, along with dissatisfaction with the Russian-dominated Soviet Union. As part of the openness created with glasnost, the communist government made admissions about the past, admissions of guilt and error that an earlier generation would not have made. For one, the government announced Soviet responsibility for the massacre of Polish officers in the Katyn Forest during World War II. More significantly, for the nationalist question within the Soviet Union, was the admission that the Soviets had signed a secret protocol within the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany, which enabled the Soviet Union to annex the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Once this admission came to light, it raised the question of the legitimacy of the Baltic states' incorporation into the Soviet Union, and spurred independence movements. The Baltic states would be the first to secede from the Soviet Union in 1990, and other regions and republics within the Soviet Union wanted greater autonomy or even independence. Politically, Gorbachev's reforms undermined the Communist Party's monopoly of political power in the state and allowed one man, Boris Yeltsin, to become an effective opposition figure not only to the Communist Party generally, but to Gorbachev himself particularly. In 1987, multi-candidate, though not multi-party elections were held, and in 1990 Gorbachev legalized the formation of other political parties, removing from the Soviet constitution an article guaranteeing a leading role for the Communist Party. These reforms were clearly opening up the political system within the Soviet Union. The economic crisis was foundational to the entire reform process. If the Soviet Union had been in anywhere near a sound shape, then it is likely the political forums and opening up of dialogue and discussion would not have been necessary. As it was, however, the Soviet Union was in decline. Indeed, the Soviet economy reached its height between 1966 and 1970, and thereafter lost ground. By 1980, the economy had stopped growing. The structural deficiencies of a centralized, planned economy were significant. There was an absence of incentives, and hard work or increased production was not highly rewarded. In the Soviet system, work was a right, and so unemployment was neither expected nor accepted. It was a corrupt and inefficient system. Enough food was produced to feed the nation, but because of distribution issues, grain rotted on the ground, while valuable government resources went to importing grain. The arms race, keeping up with the Americans, meant that vast portions of government expenditure were swallowed up when they could have been used elsewhere. In the end, Gorbachev's reforms were clearly well-intentioned. They were meant to revitalize the economy and nation. In effect, though, they were corrosive, weakening rather than strengthening the Soviet Union, leading to breakaway republics, opposition heroes, and a failed coup d'etat. For close to 7 decades, the Soviet Union was the world's largest multinational state, stretching over 1/6 of the Earth's surface, covering 11 time zones, and containing close to 300 million people. It was a world superpower for over 40 years. Its collapse ended this, and with it, the Cold War. Events in Eastern Europe were in some ways similar. Economically, there were similar structural deficiencies in the communist countries, which permitted inefficiencies and resulted in dissatisfied citizens who waited in long queues for small availability of poorly made products. Beginning in Poland, these regimes faced mounting pressure for change, which, by the later 1980s, they could no longer afford to simply oppress and quash with state violence. Gorbachev had made clear that these Eastern European governments would be responsible for their own destinies and reforms. They could not look to Bigger Brother to sort things out by a show of force, as in the good old days. The communist system in Eastern Europe collapsed because the Soviet Union allowed it to. It did not prop it up by force. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead. Perhaps the most potent symbol of Eastern European communism in the divide between East and West was the literal divide in Berlin, the Berlin Wall. The wall was erected in 1961 to stop the hemorrhage of East Germans voting with their feet, choosing to live in the West, desperate to free and live in the West. When the communist governments began toppling like dominoes in 1989, the destruction of the Berlin Wall, the opening up of the border between East and West Germany was immensely significant and symbolic, even if the poor Germans were subjected to David Hasselhoff singing about freedom. Finally, the two Germanys were reunited into one single country again. Note that because there was no formal end to the occupation of Germany following the end of World War II, the occupying powers of America, Britain, France, and Soviet Union had to formally relinquish their rights of occupation and control, even though they had not exercised those official powers for decades.